Thank you very much, Runa. And thank you to my supervisor, Maurice Riedel, and the members of my doctoral committee, Ebba Hvannberg, Hanno, Scharr, and Henrik Göbbert. I also especially thank the opponents, Thomas Odaker and Michael Pound, for being here and evaluating my thesis. My thesis is titled Design and Evaluation of Data Analysis and Augmentation Approaches for Functional Structural Plant Models. I started this thesis after graduating in applied mathematics as my master's degree. And during the course of my PhD, I supervised a master's student on root data segmentation, and I also taught 2 courses annually. I contributed to book chapters, articles, and events. In Iceland specifically, I also contributed to the Icelandic HPC community efforts, both nationally and internationally. And most specifically, my research stay in fall 2022 yielded the implementation of the Synovis framework. Here I also contributed to events and retreats and talks. If you're a member of the audience or currently in the audience, all link material is in this QR code. You can scan the QR code and have the full link list. Say this immediately so you have the opportunity to do so. This talk starts with a brief outline of the main challenges, particularly from a plant modeling perspective, highlighting the scientific processes that contribute to such models. And since the thesis has a lot of technical aspects, we're also going to be introducing certain aspects of visualization and high-performance computing. Before we are talking about the main aspects of this thesis, which are also combined into software products, Synovis and vRoot. I will pick some results from my work and present those before I take a brief summary and describe where we are currently and where we would go from here. Regarding the plant models and plants specifically, what we can say is that plants are not only a key in future development, food safety and things like that, but also most affected by changes to climate. And taking the top path, we would ideally like to know what about plants make them resilient, and also ideally like to influence that. And in the bottom path, we would like to find more sustainable farming practices that work within our planetary boundaries and also withstand the test of decades. This comes with a few challenges that are largely focused around knowledge on how plants work, how aspects of them work, and these challenges are presented primarily in different ways, and these ways are that the structure of the plant is fairly complex. It also has flat leaves, and extracting the structure can be quite a complicated task, particularly regarding also the fact that the structure influences the function of the plant and the function influences the structure of the plant. When we measure things on plants, we also measure a lot of different data, certain quantitative data on gas exchange or water exchange, certain measurements in the soil or on the plant, but we also measure a lot of pictures. We also measure 3D data in parts. And all of this comes together to an extremely multimodal data set on an experiment. Also, when we model these plants, these models integrate a lot of different processes, and they integrate a lot of different aspects of the plant, and all of this kind of has to be calibrated together to form a representative view of what the experiment actually says. In my thesis, I specifically focus on specific challenges of plant scientists, particularly regarding their work, and I address them with the use of software and computational engineering. The Synovis framework is published as open source and also in the journal In Silico Plants. It's focused primarily on the fact that experiments are largely require also the annotation of a lot of auxiliary data. There's a lot of individual data that is being often manually labeled that helps in the process of getting access to more sophisticated feature extraction tools. And the Synovis framework aims at enabling a model informed by plant models pipeline to generate synthetic data, specifically also for these intermediate steps, extraction steps such as segmentation or similar. On the other hand, particularly regarding the model calibration, I'm going to be talking about vRoot, which is a software that's more directly aimed at extracting three-dimensional measurements for the purpose of configuring plant models. It's also available as open source and was published in the Plant Phenomics journal. The particular challenges that vRoot addresses is also the fact that the plant structure, in this case the root system, is very complex and requires a lot of expert knowledge to extract it into a good representative data set. Both of these software pieces also focus on visualization, and visualization in general is the way of creating an image from data. Unreal Engine can create virtual environments, and which is also the focus on why we are using the Unreal Engine, particularly regarding the fact that it is also from even from other game engines designed specifically around creating virtual environments, whereas other applications focus sometimes on different things. But since we are populating geometries, plant geometries in this virtual environment, we are using the Unreal Engine. It also allows us to use user-centered visualization techniques in the shape of head-mounted displays. And if for the visualization set, I'm going to just briefly describe it. On the left, we have our plant, and it's the real-world experimental plant. And to simulate it, we do certain simplifications on the structure because we can't go to the smallest detail amount possible and then simulate all of that, because at the current stage of technology, it would be too cumbersome to try to simulate. So we do simplifications. These simplifications also inform our functional simulation. And particularly this connection is important because the structural simplifications also make the functional simulation well posed. And what we do with the visualization, we try to bring this back a little bit more into what it would look like into the real world while trying to retain this functional information. We also do this for the purpose of generating synthetic data. And here, the idea of it is that deep neural networks, particularly image analysis models, will extract certain emergent properties of the image structure. Even if there's like a quantification in the end, there is always a feature extraction step that is learned somewhere in those layers. And it might be something like edge detection or similar, but the deep neural network will learn certain aspects of what the image looks like. Synthetic data in this way aims at having an informed virtual scene that also exhibits these structures that we would expect in the real world. So it's directly aimed at essentially getting a databases to pre-train those bulk layers that need a very good feature extraction to then be able to have a better databases. The example here from Bondi et al. From a 2018 conference is a wildlife biodiversity data set also produced with the Unreal Engine. And the pipeline that I implemented is seen on the left, which is also an Unreal Engine scene using FSPM data. And I typically focus on agricultural fields. And since these agricultural fields tend to be very large, we use high performance computing because it's a way of enlarging the problem without sacrificing detail. And the central idea about high performance computing is we have our simulation domain and we pull this huge problem apart into smaller problems that can be solved manageably individually, and then we recombine the solution. The supercomputers I'm specifically talking about are the Eureka and Lewis supercomputer at the UD Supercomputing Center in Germany and the Lumi supercomputer at the Center for Scientific Computing in Finland. These also have a very specific aspects, which is that they are modular. They have certain nodes, i.e. specific computers in this huge cluster of computers that do specific tasks. They might be more closely coupled or more loosely coupled, but that's also a core aspect of the thesis. And when I talk about the thesis, we will move through the thesis objectives. They are marked by TO a little bit in the order of which they were developed. And particularly regarding the first objective surrounding the Synovis framework and the inaugural publication and implementation of the Synovis framework. Here, the central idea that I started with was I want to have a dynamically coupled virtual environment to replicate the variety of individual effects one might see in the real world, to allow the synthetic data pipeline to first be reactive, and second of all, also have this component of I can very quickly prototype additional effects for the virtual scene without having to go to extreme lengths to reproduce the data. This also rests on good plant models, and these good plant models are also directly addressed by the implementation of the vRoot software. And the associated laboratory user study are conducted to evaluate it. And once we move back up to the larger field level, I focused on specific use cases in surrounding agricultural data analysis that I can map onto the implementation of the Synovis framework. Then I implemented and tested these use cases, and that is the third objective. Regarding the live coupling and specifically also the functional coupling, in the end, we have plant models. They have certain amount of semantic information, and it would be good to also combine this into the virtual scene, particularly first of all, to be able to extract certain additional measurements or kinds of data labels, but also to use essentially the virtual scene and its rendering functionality to also give something back to the plant model with this coupling. And since I talked about plant models already so often, the functional structure plant model, FSPM, also that we are using is called cPlantBox. The central idea is that we have a description of how the plant grows. And we put this essentially into a generator, and this generator will produce a plant structure. This can be coupled to individual things, but generally it will definitely produce a structure. We take the structure and we geometrize the structure. Once we embed it into the Unreal Engine, this is also one of the aspects where the Unreal Engine directly also affects how the data is produced, since the changing of individual aspects, it's not only the plants, it's also not only effects on the texture or surrounding the textures, but also the light conditions. It will change certain aspects of the structure of the image. Just, for example, the shadows are pointing a different way, or the general hue of the image will be different, and also the ability to change camera settings, for example. This is ultimately rests on a live coupling, and this live coupling is centered around the Synovis implementation. The idea of the Synovis implementation is the fact that I have a virtual environment and I want to couple certain other nodes to it. And in the general implementation of the Synovis framework, I usually consider simulator nodes that produce a simulation or produce data that we can use to include that into the scene. And also AI nodes that prompt the virtual scene, that measure data, that ask for certain kinds of labels or ask for certain kinds of outputs. And the modular supercomputers all have also, since this is directly implemented for modular supercomputers, so they have a specific unique challenge, which is the fact that if we do this kind of setup and the AI node runs on, or like the AI training runs on an AI node, and the Unreal Engine runs on a visualization node, we need to essentially bundle all of this a little bit together to have an easier way of orchestrating these data streams, particularly if we move a little bit further apart in a supercomputing center. Synovis Frameworks handles this through the use of bundling and using SSH tunnels for the communication. But ultimately, I designed it around WebRTC, which is a fact that a little bit helps in the of making the framework more future-proof, because it's based on the standard rather than the software, which helps a little bit for certain things. But the WebRTC standard also is a standard for real-time communication of media streams, also of audio streams. And for the simulators, we use the data channel essentially for the setup of the information. I'm going to show this once in how it looks in the Unreal Engine. It is rendered at runtime, and we include plants into the Unreal Engine at runtime as well. The textures are actually templates. So in Unreal, you can template materials for what the surface looks like. And I template these materials, and through the Synovis framework, I include runtime information so that with the structure in place, one can steer what the surface would actually look like. And this essentially brings the first milestone to a close with the Synovis implementation standing and the whole data framework concept implemented and tested on these supercomputers, particularly regarding their functionality and the compatibility. So we shift focus a little bit and we go down into more detail to the model calibration. Because the root application is not only an application implementation on its own, but it's also embedded into a larger workflow. Because for the plant models, there's a lot of information that goes into these plant models. And here specifically, since plants are one continuous system between soil, plant, and atmosphere, we are taking a look at the root systems, which are a little bit tricky to extract in certain ways. Particularly since the general setup of this pipeline is that we have an experiment and we do all of those extraction steps, and we would always like to automatically extract the root systems. That is always in a way the goal, but still currently through various reasons, certain automatic tools sometimes struggle with plant topology, for example, or certain aspects of the root structure that should be corrected. An example here in Selzner et al., a paper in Plant Phenomics from 2023. And here also an important part is the fact that the correction of the annotation is also very important, which is what I developed the root for. So to just show it on a video with me annotating, I developed it for head-mounted displays, which are 3D displays you can wear on your head. And this is me annotating. Normally, it's not me annotating because I don't have the extensive plant knowledge that is required to actually extract these kinds of data sets. I will often mislabel the taproot, but this is the general idea and setup of the pipeline, is that you can also start with an annotation and correct it. This always also depends on the fact that it's an application, it requires people. So if you have to evaluate something that requires human interaction, it is important to evaluate it with humans. So I conducted a human participant laboratory study of mixed design. The general workflow of that study is participant comes in, we take some preliminary measurements, preliminary forms, and the participant will be trained in both the root and the comparison application and routing, which is a desktop application, and they have a training phase. After this training phase, they will conduct the actual extraction task for the study, during which they will not receive assistance anymore. For most measures, we found higher accuracy, particularly in the F1 score of the correctly identified roots. And we evaluated this using also synthetic data. You see here an example of a C plant box FSBN simulated root system with water noise, in this case uniform to not have additionally depth-dependent effects that might be in the data somewhere. And this is essentially also an important step towards having a more robust model calibration, and these models need to be quite robust if we are going to use them in all of our downstream pipelines. And speaking of these downstream pipelines, we are aiming and wanting to build large virtual worlds. And these fields, typically, we don't simulate in one continuous setting that many plants typically, because it's quite difficult for certain aspects to do it. And also from the rendering perspective, we don't, in the detail that we could have on certain plants, we don't typically render that many. But modern agricultural fields have millions of plants with an average field size of about 36 hectares, as demonstrated by recent remote sensing studies. The two use cases that I specifically focused on in also collaboration with plant scientists are crop or field reconstruction and this idea of flyover remote sensing. So here we might focus on the second part first to just showcase a little bit what the actual idea here is. There is an idea in machine learning that is called active learning. It has uses in different domains, uses in different subjects. The general idea is you see based on the training results that certain settings, certain configurations might be still a little bit more troublesome than others. So you, in this case, try to reproduce them and produce more of that specific configuration space. Still should have a lot of variety. And this is also, in this case, since we don't need a coherency necessarily, we just always create new data. But it's also not just the absence of coherency, it's also just the dynamic nature of the framework. The second part of this use case scenarios is essentially if we have one continuous field that we also would like to observe through time, what we there would do is domain partitioning is something that is typical in visualization frameworks. Also has certain specific uses. Domain partitioning in game engines is a little bit difficult. There's some related work on for large-scale MMOs, for example, but not specific for these kinds of problems. The main challenge here is also that you need a continuous camera picture, but you need basically a region that is high detail that you can focus on while the camera is there. So the idea is distribute the scene, have a high detail region and low detail outside. And there the camera would fly into a region and get connected to a certain node and then disconnected upon exit. The transition essentially in a way is up to the user, but there are different transition options for this. But it's more of a video task. Then the pressure point for this, though, is we have the supercomputers, and this was also specifically tested on the Jurica DC supercomputer. It has GPU nodes, which are single computers in this cluster, that have 4 GPUs. So we would ideally like to run Unreal also 4 times on that node. The pressure point there is that Unreal Engine might interfere with itself a little bit. So I measured that specific aspect when running Unreal Engine on Xenovis on a node 4 times, how it affects the frame time and the rendering speed. And we do see higher frame times and a larger variance, particularly since Unreal doesn't necessarily schedule with itself. But it's still extremely manageable for a certain number of plants, and up to 5,000 in this example. The primary point there is also modern supercomputers might allow you to do something that's called pinning that helps with these issues, but that's more of a more specific aspect of the specific supercomputer. With this kind of framework and also the domain partitioning, we use actually also this domain partitioning heavily when we move on to the coupling of functional information. And particularly, we are focused on, I want to actually get the light from the scene back into the plant model. That was the idea here, because there is a rendering framework, and I should be able to use it. But to do that, I briefly need to explain how Unreal actually renders, because it doesn't simulate photons. Obviously, not all photons would actually hit the camera, but it essentially shoots measurement rays from the image plane into the scene. And the implementation there that's without heuristics is called path tracing. And this path is measured essentially from the camera into the object. And there it can undergo the usual thing also a photon might go. But like the Unreal Engine, for example, then tests for, do I have direct line of sight to a light source? What is the reflection coefficient? And other things like subsurface or emission. For the diffuse measurement, meaning just like light gets reflected in other places in the scene, and we would still be hit by indirect light, it does a hemispherical sampling on the surface of the object. And below, it also shows object, like very exaggerated object configurations for this essentially example sphere. We are using this, but not in the way that you would typically imagine plants in a scene to look like, because we are not visualizing the plants in a normal way, because we are looking at it from kind of a model perspective. Because this is not, we use the normal rendering pipeline, but like not in the visible spectrum, so to speak. But we are more focusing on the photosynthetic active radiation, which is a subspectrum of the whole light spectrum. So this is essentially, this is introduced at runtime. This is a small cluster for the demonstration. The measurement takes place at points that are submitted via Python. And here I also, for the photosynthesis simulation with the virtual world coupled to it, I also performed a scaling measurement. And the scaling measurement started with 500 plants in one node, and then we increase the node count. Here you also see something that is specific to memory-bound applications, which it appears to scale much better than the optimal line. It's because, of course, it's faster because there are less plants, but it's also faster since there are less plants, the render step is faster. So it's essentially double the fast. But you see that in other domains as well. And here for the example of a node and a single node of the DC module has essentially 2 CPUs, 4 graphics cards, and half a terabyte of memory. This only really works if we have field data, validated field data. And so I compared this to winter wheat experiment from 2016, sown in October, growing season started around April. You see the gas exchange measurement at the top was published in Nature Scientific Data by Nguyen and al. And I used different data from a weather station for this. You see that both the light influx agrees quite well, and subsequently also the CO2 uptake, but those are of course coupled quite closely. And of course, we don't capture all of the effects, but this is essentially a step towards being able to have a more close functional coupling. And with that, essentially also implemented and tested based on an experiment, I will give a brief additional summary of the 4 points. Starting from this kind of idea of having the complex scientific workflows around functional structural plant models, we have our calibration of these models on the left, where I kind of want to generate more of this auxiliary data to help to gain access to certain AI tools to help in the extraction through the use of the Synovis framework. I also developed ReRoot, and which directly facilitates the extraction of already quite more complex and requiring expert knowledge data for the purpose of being able to calibrate these models. And taking the Synovis implementation, I also took a look at how big can we get and how would we actually run it on supercomputers in different scenarios? What would the setup be like? And how would it work, particularly on the pressure points? But also then if we want to have a functional coupling, have a more close coupling between the model and the virtual scene, I took a look at the direct measurement for the photosynthetic evaluation. There is ongoing use and also usage requests for both ReRoot and the Synovis framework, also from different domains, but specifically regarding being able to build a community around existing software pieces so that they get reused, and also that the development is sustainable around both users and developers. And the community building is an important step going forward, particularly also regarding getting more benchmarks for how the training would actually perform, particularly at scale, but also getting more automation into the creation of the actual virtual worlds. Moving to different domains, also, it's always a more specific question, particularly regarding, since the framework is produced quite dynamically, there are certain pressure points regarding the adaptation, particularly regarding how to map data, how to map measurement devices. But specifically also in the UD Supercomputing Center, the Synovis framework is going to be used further. ReRoot especially also sees a lot of particularly community and public-focused work. And I also get requests by other institutes. And with that, I thank everyone. And that concludes my talk.